this video I'll be making some jewellery boxes. Recently I found a wooden fire surround which had been left out on the streets. I'm not sure what type of wood it is, it might be meranti. The colour varies from a deep red to a pale beige colour, and the grain was pretty interesting. You might have noticed the change of scenery around me here. That's because I've just moved into a new house and workshop. I'm in the process of setting up the workshop at the moment. If you want to find out more about that, you can either follow me on Instagram, where I'll be posting some regular updates, and you can support the channel on Patreon, where you'll get early access to my YouTube videos. There'll be a YouTube video about the new workshop coming soon. Links to both my Instagram and my Patreon are in the description box below. The project in this video was filmed a few weeks back at my old workspace.
First I wanted to break the fire surround down into usable pieces of wood. It was held together with glue and pin nails, and I used a mallet to help me break it down. I used my pincers to remove as many of the nails as possible. Some of them came out nice and cleanly, others were at the end of the boards so I could just cut those away, and I used a Sharpie to mark up where I would make those cuts. And a few of the nails broke as I was trying to pull them out. I needed to be careful not to feed any wood that had metal in it through any of my woodworking machines, so I marked up those areas with a Sharpie too to make them easier to spot. I used the table saw to cut away some of the imperfections and nail holes to get all of the pieces to some consistent sizes with clean edges. The offcuts are going to be used for firewood, and I sorted all of the good usable pieces of wood into piles based on their widths. I'm going to use the widest panels for the top of the boxes, the less wide pieces for the sides of the boxes, and I'll also find a use for some of the thin pieces later in the project too.
To make these boxes more interesting, I wanted to have a go at cutting some compound mitre angles at the mitre saw to give the boxes a cool angular shape. Before making those cuts though, I first wanted to rip a 10-degree angle to both of the long edges of the side panels.
I used my digital angle gauge for this. You can find a link to this and the other tools that I use at the My Tools link in the description box below. This allows me to set the angle of my table saw blade with good accuracy, and then I can rip both of the edges to that angle. And this is how the pieces turned out. I then tilted the head of my mitre saw to 45 degrees, and then I wanted to set my bevel gauge to 10 degrees off 90 to match the angle I cut at the table saw earlier. I can then use the bevel gauge to set the swivel on my mitre saw, lining up the bevel gauge to the slots on the insert plate of the saw. I then made the compound angle cut to one end of each of the pieces, and to cut the opposite end, I could swivel the saw by the same amount again, but this time in the opposite direction. To cut these pieces to consistent lengths, I actually just used the text on the base of my mitre saw as a reference. I'm using the D in the word wide, and when that D disappears behind the workpiece, I make the cut. Then I could flip the workpiece over, offer it up to the same place, make the next cut, flip again, make the cut, and so on to give me lots of side panels all the same length. Each panel then got sanded at 120 grit using the belt sander to remove the old finish. To glue the side panels together, I'm going to use some masking tape. I add wood glue to each joint, and the tape acts as a hinge, allowing me to fold up the assembly and glue it all together nice and tight. I then apply some gentle clamping pressure using a couple of F-clamps. The joints came together really nicely. These mitre joints won't be super strong at this point, but later I'll be reinforcing them by adding a plywood bottom panel which is going to be glued in place. While waiting for the glue to dry, I could start making the lids for the boxes. First I put them through the thickness planer to clean up the faces, and then I could clean up the edges at the table saw so that I can glue the boards together to form panels. Because I'm making 3 of these jewellery boxes at the same time, I can use the same clamps to glue up all of the panels at once. And then I make sure all of the panels are properly seated on the bars of the clamps so that I know that they are going to be flat. While waiting for the glue to dry, I cut a rebate around the bottom edges of the box using my router. This will later accommodate a bottom panel, but I don't want to add that panel just yet, and I'll explain why shortly. After a few hours, once the glue was dry, I sanded at 120 grit using my random orbit sander. And then I offered up the box to the panel and marked both the inside and outside edges, and this is why I didn't add the bottom panel earlier on. I also mark up which lids go with which boxes so that they don't get confused later. I used the bandsaw to cut the lids to size, making sure to stay on the waist side of the line. And then I can refine the edge, sanding right up to the pencil line at the belt sander to get the edge perfectly straight. At this point I decided to add a decorative bevel to the edges of the lids too, with my table saw blade tilted to 45 degrees. This wasn't something I had planned to do, but I thought the bevel would complement the angled side panels. I did some sanding to clean up those cuts. Here I'm setting up a sacrificial fence at the table saw so that I can cut some thin strips. Hot glue and a block of wood ahead of the blade allows me to make a cut, move the fence, make the next cut, and so on. This is safer than cutting them against the actual table saw fence. These pieces will be used on the inside of the lid to help position it correctly onto the box, and I decided to mitre the corners of these pieces, making the cuts at the bandsaw, and then sanding to get all of the pieces fitting together nicely. And those pieces got glued on level with the lines that I'd marked up earlier and held in place with some spring clamps. When the glue was dry, one of the lids fitted perfectly, while the other two needed a bit of refining to get them to fit, and I did that by scraping away some of the material with the end of a chisel. Most of my mitre joints on the side panels came out pretty much perfect, and that's all thanks to that digital angle gauge that I used earlier. But you can see here there's a tiny hairline gap, and I wanted to show in this video how I resolved that. I'm using a burnishing tool here, although I could have used the shaft of a screwdriver or anything like that really to burnish the fibres of the wood and close the gap. I then do a bit of sanding, and the difference here is pretty subtle, but here's how it looked after and here's how it looked before. Next I'm going to cut some bottom panels, and I'm just using some offcuts of thin hardwood plywood for this. I found a large washer that roughly matches the diameter of the corners of the rebate and used that to mark up the corners of the plywood, and I shaped those at the disc sander. Then I made a few refinements with a block plane to get them to fit nicely, and I glued them in place, and these panels are going to help provide extra strength to the mitre joints of the side panels. For finish I used some of my handmade oil wax mixture. This is available to buy via my Etsy store if you're interested, link to that in the description box below. It brings out the colour and the beauty in the wood grain and leaves a really smooth finish too. I rub it on in a circular motion using a cotton cloth, and then I use another clean cotton cloth to remove any excess wax, and that's all there is to it. And then after a few hours I buff out the wax with another cloth to give it a nice natural sheen. Here I'm finding the centre of the lid, and then I can drill a hole for some of these gold metal handles to be added, which I picked up on eBay. I add my maker's mark to the bottom of the boxes. I had some green felt left over from the oak box restoration I did recently, and I thought I'd use some of this to line the bottom of the boxes. I carefully measured and marked up for size, and then made the cuts with a sharp knife. I then masked up the inside of the side panels and applied some spray adhesive to both the bottom panel and the back of the felt. And after waiting a minute or two for the glue to go tacky, I can then carefully position it. And you only really get one shot at this because the glue bonds instantly. It's a bit tricky, and to be honest I didn't get it as perfectly positioned as I'd have liked, but it was just about good enough, and I later trimmed off any excess with a sharp knife.
I'm quite pleased with how these jewellery boxes turned out. It was nice to work with reclaimed wood again. Aside from wanting to find a use for the wood from the fire surround before I moved house, because it's much easier to pack and move 3 small jewellery boxes rather than 1 large fire surround, another reason for the project was that I really wanted to try some compound mitre angled cuts. I'd never done it before. It did take me a little while to figure out how I was going to cut all of the angles so that they would all meet up nicely, and what order to make those cuts in too, but using the digital angle gauge made it relatively easy to get nice accurate angles, and that made the glue ups quite straightforward really. All 3 of the boxes are now available for sale at my Etsy store. You can find a link to that in the description box below. This project took about 10 hours to complete, and that was to make all 3 of the boxes. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like to receive early access to my videos, exclusive content, free project cut lists and plans, and a name credit at the end of my videos too, you can help to support the channel on Patreon, and there'll be a link to that in the description box below. Thank you for watching.